This is AMD's newest graphics card, the RX 7600 XT. This here is the Power Color Hellhound model. The starting MSRP for these cards is $330, a price point that really helps to fill in the gaps of AMD's current lineup. You know, before this we had a pretty big jump between the $270 7600 and then the $450 7700 XT. So, you know, finding a card that's kind of in the middle, it's not like in the direct middle, but somewhere in the middle at $330 is pretty welcomed. Now, price-wise, I think this is a very accessible card that is on the more affordable side of things, you know, considering that AMD's top-of-the-line cards are like, what, $800-900? And then if you look over at NVIDIA, we're talking $1,600, really like $2,000 because the 4090s are being scalped. So, I know $300-ish, $350 is not an insignificant amount of money, but in the grand spectrum of available graphics cards that you can buy in the current gen, this is on the more affordable side. Not only that though, AMD has actually gone and done it. They have heard the cries of the gaming PC community. 16 gigabytes of VRAM packed into this for only $330. That's what everybody wanted, right? You know, all the discourse about companies skimping on VRAM, charging absurd amounts of money when they did give you the extra VRAM. Well, here's their answer. An affordable graphics card with 16 gigabytes of video memory. Problem solved, right? I'm not sure if you can tell by the tone of my voice, but this is not everything it appears to be, and you'll see why when we get to the benchmarks, because specs are one thing, but actual performance is another, and oh boy, the actual performance of this card we are going to talk about. But before we do that, let's take a look at the different cards I tested to compare the 7600 XT against to determine if it's worth your money. At $330, AMD's toughest competition is actually itself in the form of their last generation's RX 6700 XT. These are going for $330 as of this video, and this isn't a recent development or anything like that. They've been priced like this for months now. Being the exact same price, this is the card to do the direct card-to-card comparison for. Now, on NVIDIA's side of things, the closest card in terms of cost is the RTX 4060, which is pretty regularly found at $300-ish. And while not exactly the same price, it is the closest from Team Green. And then, because I wanted to see the performance differences across generations, I tested the RX 6600 XT, the direct predecessor to the 7600 XT. Man, if you take a look at these cards though, look at them side by side. They did not make any attempts to even update the design. Now, these power colors didn't anyways. I haven't seen all the other cards. But yeah, the 6600 XT, this has reduced in price by so much since the launch that the price tier compared to everything else here is not even the same. Remember how these launched at $380 back in 2021? Well, now they're down to $240 pretty regularly, so this is just here purely for the direct gen-to-gen comparison. Now here are the key specs of these cards. As always, feel free to pause the video if you want to look through them more thoroughly, but I'm not a huge specs person myself. You'll probably know this if you've seen any of my other videos. I prefer to let the performance do the talking. For my test system, I decided to go with a more realistic approach this time around, which means I paired these cards with a more practical CPU that in the real world, you know, more people would be likely to pair them with, not like a Ryzen 9 or an i9 or anything crazy powerful or expensive like that. I went with the Ryzen 5 7600 paired with a B650 Aorus Elite AX motherboard and 32GB of DDR5 Team Group Vulkan at 6000 CL30. My test system is like the cookie cutter build that you can put together for $1,000 or less, which I personally think is a great budget to have for a first PC. I'll show some examples on the screen of a couple of builds that I quickly threw together on PC Part Picker. These are pretty balanced systems, and it really goes to show that there's quite a bit of flexibility in PC building, and you could build a great system that can use cards in this tier for as low as like $850 or even closer to the $1,000 mark if you want to go with a newer platform with a bit more future proofing like I'm using for this test system. Now, because I'm not using some crazy powerful CPU, you're probably wondering if it'll bottleneck the graphics cards, and I specifically tested in a way to mitigate that. And that was done by testing at 1440p max settings for all of the games. You'll see in the overlays across all the tests when we get to them, the graphics cards get completely dumped on at these settings, whereas the CPU for the most part will be chilling. 1440p is also the resolution that I think is the most appropriate for these cards in general, testing aside, because these will easily run circles around games in 1080p, no questions asked, regardless of which card you pick. And they are nowhere near capable of native 4K, so that's why I focused on 1440p. Now, as of me recording this video, it is roughly like 7-ish hours until embargo lifts, and I am confident I won't be able to get this all edited and released before that. But I should have my full benchmarks video released prior to this in a separate video. I'll put a link to that in the description and in the cards for anyone who just wants to watch like my raw benchmark runs without me yapping or giving my opinions on stuff. But for anyone who does want to hear my thoughts, let's go over the numbers. We'll start with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and the way I'll reference the numbers will be using the 7600 XT as the reference. All the percentage differences are calculated relative to it, whether they be faster or slower. So in this title, the 6700 XT takes the lead, beating out the 7600 XT by 16%. The 4060 and 7600 XT are pretty neck and neck, and last as expected is the 6600 XT, which is slower than its successor by 18%. In Apex Legends, the 6700 XT leads again, this time by 14% over the 7600 XT. The 4060 results are close here as well, this time slightly edging out the 7600 XT, and the 6600 XT in this title actually closes the gap by quite a bit, coming in single-digit performance differences compared to the 7600 XT, which isn't really a good look given the near $100 price difference between the two cards. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, the 7600 XT is a bit more competitive, coming in closer to the 6700 XT, but it still can't get that win. The RTX 4060 here takes dead last place, even behind the 6600 XT, which I guess isn't too surprising since the recent Call of Duty titles have been favoring AMD graphics more than Nvidia. Note the pretty big disparity in video memory usage reported across the 4 cards in this game. The effects of how much video memory a card has can be a pretty mixed bag depending on the title, sometimes affecting performance, sometimes affecting visual quality, sometimes affecting both, and even sometimes affecting nothing at all. Video memory is kind of a delicate topic. I've seen so many people online having shouting matches over it, and it can be a really hard thing to analyze because how each game utilizes it can be completely different. Like in Call of Duty, for instance, we see wildly different video memory usage across the 4 cards, but when it came to performance, nothing looked too out of place. There wasn't jarring stuttering on the 8GB cards, there wasn't low quality textures or texture popping. And that's because Call of Duty was designed to preload as much as the map as possible if your hardware has the extra video memory to spare. Digital Foundry actually made a really good video covering this a few years ago. Definitely check that out if you haven't seen it yet. But it's a great showcase of how a game can take advantage of more VRAM if it's there, but at the same time, doesn't necessarily mean that having less VRAM will make for a detrimental or significantly worse gaming experience so long as the data stream can be supported by the card's memory buffer and bandwidth. Just something to keep in mind. Moving on, the 7600 XT sees its first victory, sort of, in Cyberpunk. Here, it actually ties with the 6700 XT, with the 4060 trailing by 10% and the 6600 XT in last place at 20% less performance. In Diablo 4, the 6700 XT once again takes the lead by a healthy 21% margin, and the 7600 XT gets slightly edged out by the 4060. A pleasant surprise that we see here is the 6600 XT, which performs very well, once again making the 7600 XT and the 4060 kind of look bad as it trails them by about 6%. Single digit gen-to-gen performance uplift is definitely not something you want to see. In Forspoken, the 6700 XT keeps the lead, trailed very closely by the 4060. Again, kind of a bad look for the 7600 XT here, which costs more but performs worse than the 4060, and also not doing too great of a job separating itself from the 6600 XT. Moving on to Fortnite, we see some heavy Nvidia favoritism, giving the 4060 one of the very few wins across all the titles I tested. Performance spread across the 3 AMD cards here is pretty narrow, with both the 6700 XT and 6600 XT coming within single-digit percentage differences of the 7600 XT. In Forza Horizon 5, the 6700 XT takes the lead back, and we see the 7600 XT nearly tying with the 4060. 6600 XT trails in last, but with some pretty solid numbers, again considering how much lower price it is than the rest of the cards. Halo Infinite had the most narrow spread among the 3 current gen cards that I saw. The 6600 XT comes in 20% slower, but again, still solid numbers at its price tag. The 6700 XT sees a huge 20% lead over the 7600 XT in Hogwarts Legacy. Both the 4060 and 7600 XT kinda take the L here because of how close they come in performance compared to the 6600 XT. The Last of Us originally launched with poor optimization, leading to trouble for cards with lower VRAM. That has since been patched and has greatly improved the game's performance, but even then, we see an interesting trend here where both the 8GB cards are not only performing the worst, but they're also spilling over into the system memory, with both at around 20GB, whereas both the 6700 XT and 7600 XT are both using about 12GB of video memory and 16-ish gigs of system memory. The 6700 XT still comes out on top though, so like the rest of the results seen thus far, having more VRAM isn't just a magical fix to improving performance when the rest of the card, in this case the 7600 XT, simply isn't powerful enough to match it. The way that I look at it, it's like the 16GB of VRAM in the 7600 XT is being bottlenecked by the rest of the specs. Next is Palworld, which has taken the gaming community by storm, one of the fastest growing games of all time that a lot of people actually thought was a meme before it released. Pokemon with guns, how ridiculous does that sound? But this game is breaking records on multiple fronts, and for a good reason, because it is refreshingly fun and super addicting. So of course I had to throw it into the benchmarks. From what I'm seeing so far, it does seem like this title favors Nvidia cards because that's the only explanation for why I can think of the 4060 comes out on top here. But the 6700 XT isn't too far behind, followed by the 7600 XT and 6600 XT on trend after that. The 4060 takes another win in Spider-Man Miles Morales by a decent margin too. I've tested this game with a number of graphics cards and can confirm that it also favors Nvidia. The 7600 XT is able to keep up with the 6700 XT here, and notably provides a smoother gaming experience as seen by the large difference in the 1% lows between the cards. That's one thing that additional VRAM can help with, but as we've seen so far, it's not really needed, or it hasn't been needed, and this is one of the more prominent cases that it's made visible. But yeah, the 6700 XT at 12GB has kind of been chugging along without much issues for the most part. In Starfield, the 7600 XT finally sees its second sort of win, and again I say that because it pretty much ties with the 6700 XT, similar to what we saw in Cyberpunk. Both cards are roughly 10% faster than the 4060, and the 6600 XT comes in 20% slower than its successor. I also tested a few of the titles with ray tracing as well, just to see how the 7600 XT performs compared to the competition. And do note that these settings and resolutions are not recommended for these cards. I personally wouldn't use ray tracing at any resolution for any card at this tier or price range, but I was curious to see how the 7600 XT would do. In Cyberpunk, we see what we've seen time and time again, with AMD trailing Nvidia. But hey, those 1% lows do be looking better when you have more than 8GB of VRAM as shown here. Over in Hogwarts Legacy, Nvidia takes the win for ray tracing again, and if anything, it's a bit disappointing that the 7600 XT doesn't do better compared to the 6700 XT, because this is their second generation of ray tracing cards. Unfortunately, being newer architecture and having newer generations of ray tracing cores doesn't necessarily translate that well when you have less of those cores on the newer cards. In Spider-Man, the 6700 XT does come close to the ray tracing performance of the 4060, but what's most interesting here for me is, again, the 1% low performance. The 7600 XT actually wins here by a long shot, and based on the results and trends seen so far, I can only attribute the increased video memory being the reason for this. With that said though, I think it's still safe to say that Nvidia remains ahead of AMD when it comes to ray tracing performance, but I think it's even safer to say that most people spending less than $350 on a graphics card aren't likely going to be turning on ray tracing anyways. Okay, so what are my thoughts on the RX 7600 XT? From the titles I tested, we see it coming in similar performance to the RTX 4060 in raster. In some titles, it swings in favor of AMD. In some titles, it swings in favor of Nvidia. But across the games that I tested, averaged out, the cards are competitive with one another, despite the 7600 being the more expensive card and having double the video memory. In that case, I don't think the performance should have been that close, so I don't think the 7600 XT is making that strong of a case for itself. The more disappointing thing though for me is that the same price 6700 XT as we saw earlier is clearly the more powerful card, coming in at the exact same price as this. Because right now, that additional 4 gigabytes of VRAM that this has, it's not really doing anything for it. There is the possibility that this card ages better than the 6700 XT in the coming years as newer titles are released. You know, that 16 gigabytes can be more useful. And just for fun, I cherry picked a situation where you can clearly see 16 gigabytes being beneficial, and that is with The Last of Us running in 4K. Remember earlier in the 1440p results, the 6700 XT was beating it by about 7% in both average and 1% lows. But here in 4K, the tables have turned, and the 7600 XT takes the lead, showing a clear-cut example of how a larger memory buffer can be beneficial. The only issue is, this is a very specific cherry-picked scenario that no one would actually play at. As I said earlier, for the types of games and resolution and graphic settings that this card will realistically be used for, 16 gigabytes isn't necessary, right now anyway. I kinda wish AMD just made this card a bit more powerful. I don't know, up the core count, up the clock speeds, do something. Even if it didn't beat the 6700 XT, if it at least matched the performance, then you could say that this is a good value card, because that's the reputation the 6700 XT has. At $330, it is a very popular, highly recommended, beloved card right now. The performance it gives at its price, mwah. Great card, great value, pretty universally praised from all the reviews, Reddit threads, Twitter posts, YouTube comments, etc. that I've seen. If the 7600 XT could at least match that performance, it doesn't need to do better, just do the same, coming in at the same price, then there's no reason for it not to get the same treatment and love. You would then be able to easily argue that because it does have that extra bells and whistles, like the additional 4 gigabytes of VRAM, it does have the AV1 encoding, even though we didn't talk about it, it has an additional generation's worth of driver support, it would be the clear-cut better buy, and there would be no more reason to pick up the 6700 XT anymore. But that's just not the case. It's about 10% slower, so then you need to make the decision, is the lower performance worth the trade-off of future-proofing of the VRAM, you know, the AV1 encoding, things like that. The thing about AMD is they offer their newest features like FSR3 frame generation and fluid motion frames to last-gen cards as well. So it's not like these new features, and this is a good thing, you know. I think it's good that they have all those features and provide it for not only the newest cards, so people with older stuff can utilize it as well. Because of that, it kind of bites them in the butt or shoots themselves in the foot, because people still can flock towards the older cards and not buy the newest stuff they're releasing. It's like a double-edged sword for them. I tested FSR3 frame generation in Call of Duty as well, and look at that, the numbers go through the roof across actually all the cards. Even Nvidia gets to have fun with it as well. But hey, the 6700 XT still wins there. Same with Forspoken, the 6700 XT is still the clear winner. It's not like the technology works better on the newer gen cards either, so that's one less reason for people to consider the 7600 XT. Now, it's not all gloom and doom. While the 6700 XT would still be my top recommendation of these cards, the 7600 XT isn't falling so far behind that I would completely write it off. I could see a legitimate reason for people wanting to pick it up, whether it be because they're using features like the AV1 encoder that simply doesn't exist on the 6700 XT, or because, you know, they are going to be keeping the card for a really long time. Not everybody upgrades every 1 or 2 years. Some people keep their stuff for like 5-6 years. So, you know, they might be considering the future-proofing angle there with the extra VRAM. I feel like the PC community is so polarizing that if something isn't like the best value, instead of just stepping it down to, you know, like great value or good value or decent value even, or okay value, people just write it off as like the bottom trash garbage tier waste of sand. Like guys, there's more to the hierarchy than the extreme goods and the bads. You know, that's where I think this card falls. It falls kind of like in the middle at decent value. Yes, there will be a card that a lot of people I think are gonna see as the clear better value option, but that's just how it is sometimes. Every card can't hold the best value crown for its price bracket. It doesn't mean that it is completely trash or garbage there, right? And of course, we are talking about new pricing here. Once you start looking at options in the used market, then for sure the 7600 XT falls a couple more notches in the value conversation, because at $330, you have much more options. It's just not a fair comparison though, because no duh, buying something used is better value than buying something new. Brand new cards like this just simply don't exist in the secondhand market yet. So, you know, it's not an apples to apples comparison. But yeah, that's it for my coverage of the 7600 XT. I'm curious to hear your thoughts now. What do you think of this card overall? Good? Bad? Somewhere in between? Mediocre? If you were in the market for a brand new graphics card and had $350 or less to spend, what card would you buy? Whether it be any of these or something else. I know I didn't do the ARC A770. Thinking back, I should have done it because it is another 16GB card and it's priced under 350 bucks. I know, I'm sorry. Looking back, I should have done it. I'm using one in my own system right now, but just based on the performance that it had previously when I tested it, you know, it didn't seem to perform to the tier of these other cards, but it has had driver updates that I really should have done the comparison. So maybe for a future video. But yeah, what card would you buy at $350 or less in, you know, the new space? I mean, I think I know what the majority of people will answer even before seeing your responses, but I'm still curious to see what the spread would be. And for the people who do choose the minority answers, I want to see the reasons why. But yeah, that's gonna wrap it up for this video though. I hope you enjoyed and found this either helpful or useful in one way or another. I want to thank you all as always for watching and for continuing to support the channel. Big thanks to the channel members as always for their above and beyond support. As always, be safe out there, and I will see you all down in the comments as well as the next stream and or video. Bye.